5 days. That's all the clock had left before one of the most consequential trade deadlines in modern North American history, and the man everyone expected to blink first wasn't blinking at all. Mark Carney, the former central banker who became Canada's Prime Minister, was sitting in press conferences calmly telling reporters he wasn't looking for his pen. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, Donald Trump was publicly musing that the United States would be better off tearing up the very agreement his own first administration had signed. This is the story of how a quiet, deliberately unhurried Canadian strategy left the Trump White House scrambling in the final days before a deadline that had the power to reshape trillions of dollars in continental trade. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand what CUSMA actually is. CUSMA, known in the United States as USMCA, is the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the trade pact that replaced NAFTA. It was negotiated and signed during Trump's first term back in 2018, and it took effect on July 1st, 2020. Buried inside the text of that agreement is a clause that almost nobody outside of trade law circles paid attention to for years: a mandatory review process. 6 years after the deal took effect, all 3 countries are required to formally declare whether they want to extend the agreement for another 16 years. That 6-year mark landed on July 1st, 2026. If any of the 3 governments fails to agree to the extension, the deal doesn't die. Instead, it triggers an annual review process that can run for up to a decade, with the agreement staying in force the entire time, unless a country decides to walk away entirely, which requires 6 months formal notice. That mechanical detail turns out to be the single most important fact in this entire story, because it explains why Carney could afford to look so unbothered as the clock ran down. Rewind to the G7 summit in Evian-les-Bains, France, in mid-June. Trump, speaking to reporters, made his feelings about the trade pact unmistakably clear. He said he would rather leave the agreement unsigned or see it terminated outright than simply extend it as written. It was the kind of statement designed to rattle nerves in Ottawa and Mexico City alike, a signal that the American president saw little value in the very framework that governs the majority of trade across the continent. Reporters immediately turned to Carney for a reaction. What they got back was strikingly composed. Carney told reporters it was no secret that the president had never been the biggest fan of CUSMA or of trade deals generally, and then he pivoted, calmly, to the specific irritants Canada wanted addressed, like the ongoing dispute over forest products. There was no outrage, no counter-threat, no dramatic press conference, just an acknowledgement of reality followed by a redirection towards substance. That pattern repeated itself again and again over the following weeks, and it's worth sitting with because it's the core of what people are now calling Carney's strategy. As the July 1st deadline approached, Carney kept describing the mood as unremarkable. Speaking in Cujuac, Quebec, just one day before the trilateral virtual meeting was set to take place, he told reporters he expected a constructive exchange and said plainly that he wasn't expecting any drama the next day. He used a phrase that stuck: he wasn't looking for his pen. In other words, he wasn't going to rush into signing anything just because a deadline was approaching. If a good deal wasn't there, there would be no deal. And that was fine, because the underlying agreement wasn't going anywhere regardless. This is where the analysis gets interesting, because Carney's calm wasn't just a personality trait. It was backed by leverage that most casual observers underestimated. Canada's own trade officials, including former chief negotiator Steve Verhoeven, pointed out publicly that even with all the friction, the CUSMA tariff exemption still meant the overwhelming majority of Canadian exports to the United States moved tariff-free. Carney himself put a number on it directly, saying that despite the tariff war, Canada still had roughly 85% of its trade with the U.S. moving without tariffs, which he argued made Canada's position the best of any major American trading partner. That is a crucial data point, because it means Canada wasn't negotiating from a position of desperation. The deal already in place, flawed as it was still doing most of its job. Verhoeven also noted that the U.S. decision to maintain that CUSMA exemption at all showed that Washington still attached real importance to the agreement, whatever Trump said in front of cameras. There was also a domestic political current running in Canada's favor inside the United States itself. A bipartisan group of more than 100 members of the U.S. House of Representatives had written to the Trump administration expressing support for keeping the agreement intact. American industry groups and much of the public were broadly supportive too. So Carney wasn't just betting on the letter of the treaty text. He was betting on a coalition of American economic and political interests that didn't want to see the North American trade architecture blown up, even if the president himself sounded ambivalent about it. Now let's talk about what was actually happening on the American side while all of this calm messaging was coming out of Ottawa, because this is where Trump scrambling becomes a fair description rather than just a headline. In the days leading up to July 1st, the signals coming from Washington were genuinely inconsistent. Trump had said at the G7 that he'd rather see the deal terminated, yet his own administration had not moved to withdraw from CUSMA, and it kept the exemption tariffs in place, the very mechanism cushioning Canadian trade. His United States Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, told Congress that the review process wouldn't be finished by the July 1st date, essentially conceding in testimony what Carney had been saying in press conferences. Nobody expected this to be wrapped up on schedule. Just days before the deadline, the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Pete Huckstra, said publicly that the two countries were not anywhere close to a new framework agreement, an unusually blunt admission from a sitting ambassador just before an event his own government was hosting. At the same time, Mexico had been running its own separate parallel negotiating track. Mexico's Secretary of Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, had already completed a second round of direct talks with the United States, while Canada and the U.S. had not even formally begun their equivalent bilateral discussions. That's a telling detail. It meant that going into the deadline, Washington was juggling two very different negotiating relationships at very different stages, with no unified American position on what it actually wanted from the trilateral framework as a whole. So what actually happened on July 1st itself? Officials from all three countries held their virtual meeting as scheduled, and just as Carney had predicted, there was no drama and there was no deal. Canada and Mexico had both formally declared ahead of time that they wanted the full 16-year extension. The United States did not. As the review clause dictates, that outcome didn't kill the agreement. It triggered the fallback mechanism, an annual review process running for up to 10 years, with the underlying tariff schedules, exemptions, and rules of origin continuing to apply exactly as before. Analysts covering the story for CBC summarized the situation succinctly. CUSMA survives for now, precisely because Trump's refusal to renew is legally and practically different from actually terminating the deal. Nobody invoked the 6-month withdrawal clause. The deal just kept running, unresolved, but very much alive. This is worth pausing on because it's the single cleverest piece of the whole Carney approach. By simply not panicking, by refusing to make concessions purely to hit an artificial deadline, Canada ended up in exactly the same practical position on July 2nd that it was in on June 30th. The tariff exemptions were untouched. The trade relationship continued functioning, and Canada had conceded nothing in exchange for that continuity, because the treaty's own design meant continuity was the default outcome, not something that had to be purchased through last-minute compromises. Contrast that with how this could have played out. If Carney had rushed to secure a symbolic renewal deal purely to have a signing photo before July 1st, he would have needed to offer something significant on the sticking points the U.S. was pushing: changes to Canada's agricultural supply management system, adjustments to how Canada taxes American streaming and digital services companies, banking sector access, and provincial restrictions on selling American alcohol. Commentary from Canadian policy circles, including from the Fraser Institute, laid out exactly how difficult those asks were domestically and warned that any deal would also likely require Canada to align more closely with U.S. trade restrictions on China, effectively closing the door on any major independent trade relationship with Beijing. Those are not small, technical asks. They touch politically sensitive sectors inside Canada, from dairy farmers to cultural policy. By not rushing, Carney avoided being forced into trading away leverage on those fronts simply to beat a clock that, structurally, didn't actually require beating. None of this means the underlying trade war disappeared. Far from it. The sector-specific tariffs that predate and sit outside the CUSMA framework entirely on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and softwood lumber remained firmly in place through all of this. Those tariffs, and Canada's push to have them addressed, represent what Verheugen called the largest remaining challenge, and he was blunt in saying there had been nothing close to a good deal on the table for resolving them. So while the treaty itself survived intact, the sectoral trade war between the two countries kept grinding on in parallel, a separate and still very much unresolved front. There's also a broader political read on why Trump's team may not have been in a hurry to close this out, and it has less to do with trade economics than with domestic American politics. Analysts speaking to CBC in the days after the deadline pointed to the upcoming U.S. midterm elections as a major factor. Ordinarily, a politician wants to be able to point to a signed trade deal as a concrete achievement to campaign on. But there's an argument that Trump's political brand runs the other way. He has built his identity around tariffs themselves as the win, not around free trade agreements. One trade policy commentator, Simon Lester, put it plainly in that CBC analysis. Trump seems to see tariffs, not deals, as the thing that helps him politically. Under that theory, there was limited incentive on the American side to rush toward a finished agreement before an election cycle, and the more likely path in Lester's assessment was that talks would simply continue without resolution through the midterms, with the real decisions potentially pushed into 2027. That theory lines up neatly with everything else we've seen. It explains why Ambassador Hoekstra could say, days before the deadline, that the two sides were nowhere close to a framework, without that being treated as some sort of diplomatic crisis in Washington. If the administration's calculus was that an unresolved fight was more politically useful than a finished deal, then not close wasn't a failure. It was simply where the process was always going to sit going into the deadline. So what does this all add up to, analytically speaking? Carney's approach through this entire episode can be described as strategic patience built on structural leverage. He never had to threaten retaliation or make a dramatic public stand, because the treaty's own mechanics already protected Canada's core interests by default. He repeatedly publicly signaled that Canada would not accept what he called a bad deal, while simultaneously refusing to treat the deadline as an emergency that demanded concessions. He let the number, 85% of trade remaining tariff-free, do the talking, reminding both Canadian and American audiences that Canada already had the best arrangement of any major U.S. trading partner, deadline or no deadline. And by pointing to that bipartisan American support in Congress and among U.S. industry groups, he was implicitly signaling that Trump's own hardline instincts on trade were not universally shared, even within his own political coalition. Meanwhile, the picture on the American side looked far less coordinated. Contradictory signals from the president himself, a trade representative publicly admitting the review wouldn't finish on time, an ambassador conceding the two sides were far apart just days out, and a separate, more advanced negotiating track running with Mexico all point to an administration that hadn't settled on a single unified approach to Canada specifically. That's the scrambling. Not chaos in the sense of a crisis, but a lack of internal alignment on what outcome Washington was actually trying to engineer, right up against a deadline that Canada had spent weeks calmly signaling it wasn't afraid of. Where does this leave things going forward? The annual review mechanism now kicks in, which effectively institutionalizes uncertainty for up to the next 10 years, unless one of the three governments chooses to formally withdraw. For businesses on both sides of the border, that means continued ambiguity about the long-term durability of the framework, even though day-to-day trade in CUSMA-compliant goods continues uninterrupted. Canada will keep pressing on the sector-specific tariffs, steel, aluminum, autos, and softwood lumber, which remain the toughest, unresolved piece of the relationship. Ottawa will also have to eventually decide how far it's willing to go on the sensitive asks Washington has floated: supply management, digital taxation, alcohol sales rules, and alignment against Chinese trade, if it wants a fuller resolution rather than simply an indefinite holding pattern. But the headline outcome of this particular 5-day stretch is hard to dispute. Trump entered the window talking about terminating a deal his own administration had negotiated. Carney spent it talking about forest products and staying out of drama. And when the deadline actually arrived, the agreement Trump had mused about scrapping was still standing, fully intact, with Canada having given up nothing to keep it that way. Whether you frame that as boldness, patience, or simply a sharp read of the fine print in a 6-year-old trade text, the practical result was the same. Canada came out of the deadline in exactly the position it wanted to be in, and it was Washington that spent the final days before July 1st still trying to figure out what its own position actually was.